Dr. Kevin Bradford serves our campus this semester as adjunct professor and missionary in residence. He has served in Brazil since 1990 as a church mobilizer with pioneers and as an adjunct professor at the Word of Life Bible Seminary in Atibaia. Dr. Bradford chaired the seminary's missions department for 10 years, and he has been vice president for the Association of Brazilian Missions Professors since 2004. He also has had the privilege of serving with Christar in Amman, Jordan. He holds our Master of Arts and Cross-Cultural Missions degree, the THM, from Dallas Seminary. He's a Doctor of Ministry with a missions emphasis from the Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. He's married to his wife, Becca, and they have 2 daughters and 1 son. Kevin, thank you for spending a significant amount of your time away from Brazil with us this semester. We value your presence on our campus. Would you join me in welcoming Dr. Kevin Bradford to our campus now?
I'd like to start off thanking Dr. Bailey, Dr. Pocock, and the rest of the faculty for this privilege to be here this semester and the anticipation for the rest of the year. It has really been a pleasure for me. And also for my wife, I noticed that she walked in just a few minutes ago. I'd like to introduce her. She's seated there in the back. Becca, could you please stand? My wife and I met here on the campus a little more than 20 years ago. We were both involved in the Student Missions Fellowship, and through a series of circumstances, a little bit of encouragement from Dr. Baker and a few others, one thing led to another. We got engaged and got married shortly after her graduation. I'd like to begin with a story that you're all familiar with. I think that you're all familiar with. It comes from the Middle East. As Dr. Bailey mentioned, we spent a little bit of time there. It's the story of the wanderer, the traveler that's going through the desert. And as he is coming to the end of his own means, he stumbles across a little lamp. Have you heard this story? He finds the lamp, he picks it up, he begins to rub it, and out comes the genie, Aladdin. Well, as things go, the story tells us that Aladdin grants this traveler 3 wishes. That's always the common denominator of this story. 3 wishes, and usually, depending on who's telling the story, the traveler wastes his first wish, and then a second wish. And then he gets to the 3rd wish, and there's a little bit of a drama, a little bit of suspense. And depending on how the story goes, there's either a good ending or kind of a sad ending, melancholy ending to the story. Well, that's an interesting story. We could probably spend a little bit more time there, but I'd like to just alert you to the fact that the Bible tells a similar story. It's not a fictitious story, it's not a fable, but it's a true story. And it's a story that we can see in the Gospels. Not just one person being granted 3 wishes, but 3 people. 3 different people, each being granted 1 wish. So I invite you to turn with me to Mark chapter 10 to see this story. Mark chapter 10, beginning in verse 35. We'll pick up the narrative as it's already in progress here. Verse 35 begins saying, "Then James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came to Jesus. 'Teacher,' they said, 'we want for you to do for us whatever we ask.' 'What do you want me to do for you?' he asked. And they replied, 'Let one of us sit at your right and the other at your left in your glory.'" Now this is quite a request of these 2 young men. They came up to Jesus on the heels of Jesus' 3rd prediction in the book of Mark. It was 3rd prediction of his suffering, his death, and also his resurrection. We could see that in the preceding verses. And yet they come up with this request that they would be able to sit at Jesus' right and his left in his glory. Now I'm not sure exactly what's going on here. There's a couple of different possible interpretations. Either they weren't really paying attention to what Jesus was saying, the fact that he was going to suffer, that he was going to die, because it appears that they're very confident. Maybe they're anticipating that Jesus would overcome all the possible circumstances and be ushered into his glory in Jerusalem, just a few miles down the road. Or it could be that they're extremely inconsiderate. that they did understand what Jesus was saying, that they understood that he was going to suffer and to die. And because of his death, he needed a right-hand man, somebody that would be able to step in and assume the position of authority after he was gone. Well, if it was the latter, that's kind of a scary thought, because basically both of these two men were thinking that they could take the place of Jesus. As Mark Twain comments on this section, it's as if they were waiting for a vacancy in the Trinity. Well, there's no doubt that they both had an impressive resume, because you could think of all the disciples who could possibly take Jesus' place if that were the intent here, because they had been with Jesus from the beginning. They were part of the inner circle of disciples. They were gifted preachers, the sons of thunder. They were experienced businessmen. They had their small business enterprise there on the lake with their servants, with their father. They could also think of the references that they might present. They had some sort of connection with the high priest in Jerusalem. And then there's the familial connection. Matthew tells us that they approached Jesus not alone, not just the two of them, but with their mother, Salome, who probably was Jesus' aunt. So you can imagine the situation that the two of them were there asking for this concession and probably thinking, there's no way that Jesus can turn down Aunt Salome. But they were there asking. And they were probably thinking that their trump card, if none of the above worked, the trump card was that they got there first. They got there before the other 10 disciples. And because they were first in line, perhaps they needed special consideration. Well, Jesus responds very patiently here. He simply tells them in verse 38, you don't know what you are asking. Can you drink the cup I drink, or be baptized with the baptism I am baptized with? We can, they answered. Well, Jesus was referring to not just his experience. Drinking one's cup could have sort of a neutral connotation, but it seems to be that he's referring to his suffering here, God's coming judgment, the active obedience that he would have in drinking the cup, maybe the passive obedience or submission to God's will through this baptism. But Jesus notes that they didn't know basically what they were asking. And to confirm this, we see this response, this short response of theirs, actually a one-word response in verse 39, we can. It's almost as if they were expecting to be challenged a little bit. And as good soldiers, they were ready to salute and say, we are ready, sir. And if anything, there's an ironic nature to this response, because they really weren't ready. As we see Jesus' own response to being faced with the cup of suffering a few chapters later in Mark chapter 14. Jesus asked that be taken from him. He understood the depth of that suffering. And yet these disciples, when faced with the same challenge, they said, we are able. They indicated a self-sufficiency, which Jesus understood was really not true. So theirs was the worst of the worst of all possible conditions. Not only, not only were they ignorant of what Jesus proposed to do or what was needed in that circumstance, but they didn't know that they didn't know. And that's worse still. It's one thing to not know, but to not know that you don't know, well, that's worse. And that's where Jesus found these two disciples. So he continues very patiently in verse 39 to instruct them. Jesus said, you will drink the cup I drink and be baptized with the baptism I am baptized with, but to sit at my right or left is not for me to grant. These places belong to those for whom they have been prepared. Jesus himself was submissive to God's will. He wasn't trying to usurp the conditions that God had laid in God's sovereign plan, but he himself was acting within God's will. And he was prophesying here, looking ahead to the day in which we read about it in Acts chapter 12, that James would suffer. He would be the first of the martyrs. John also, we understand from tradition that he was probably the last of the 12 disciples to be martyred. So they would drink of this cup and be baptized with a baptism. But even so, this was a decision, an exclusive decision of the Father. Well, this first wish, we can understand that the desire has been turned down. The answer is no. But it concludes with verse 41, because it says, when the 10 heard about this, they became indignant with James and John. There's a couple of interesting things here, because the fact that they were indignant signifies that they probably wished that they had gotten there first. They're probably thinking, why didn't we think about that? Why didn't we corner Jesus and bring this up? Maybe he would have given it to one of us. The other thing that we can note is that they heard about this. James and John didn't bring up the matter for the 10. It wasn't put to a vote. They were being fairly secretive. They wanted to catch Jesus at an opportune time and bring up the matter when they thought they could get something on the others. Well, that's the first of the wishes. And we see clearly that, as Jesus states, they didn't know what they were asking for. So the wish, the desire, was turned down. But we see another wish springing up out of this as Jesus continues to teach his disciples. And we see that this is a different type of a wish that from a different person, but a wish that expresses something more in accordance with God's will. And it's a wish of Jesus himself. So Jesus in verse 42 called the disciples together and said, "You know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentile lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them." Now the terminology here, lord it over, is, if you wanted a more literal translation, it would be lord it down. They were stepping on top of these people. They were trying to rise by climbing over those that were under them. And that's one of these things that in 2,000 years since Jesus said this has really changed very little. We still see that in politics and in all spheres of business and life. People try to get the upper hand. It's a politics of trying to dominate, trying to overcome others. Politics of escalation. If you're tough, I can be tougher. As Dr. Bailey mentioned, we were in the Middle East for a while, and I think probably you can see that most clearly there. In this morning's news, in fact, you might note that Iran is testing a missile that can reach Israel, and that should be some cause for alarm, not only in Israel, but in other countries. But it's the idea that now we have a bigger missile, a more powerful missile. So what started as perhaps an interpersonal conflict became a societal conflict, now is an international conflict. It's the idea, I've heard it expressed that well, you slap me, I'm going to punch you. You grab a stick, I'm going to grab a knife. You throw rocks, I'll shoot bullets. You plant bombs, we'll launch missiles. Well, what do you do now if both sides have missiles? It's the politics of escalation, the politics of domination. And that's the track that the disciples were on. They wanted to get the upper hand of those around them. And yet Jesus is going back to the ABCs here. He had just told them, you don't know what you're asking. And here in verse 42, he says, you know that those who are regarded as rulers, so this was commonplace. This is something that they did know, but that's the way that the world runs. And then in verse 43, very abruptly, he says, not so, not emphatically, not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant. And whoever wants to be first among you must be slave of all. Now, it's interesting here that Jesus is not against the idea of leadership. In fact, he's allowing for that in these two verses. If somebody wants that type of position, he can aspire for it. But there's a different means of attaining this type of leadership. The servant and the slave, the diakonos, the doulos, the ones that would take on others' responsibilities, that would help out, that would be under orders. This is Jesus' model for leadership. And then he finishes off in verse 45 with this declaration, perhaps the most important verse in the whole book of Mark. He says, even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Now, if this were an evangelistic message, I need to spend more time at the very end talking about the ransom for many. But I just want to call your attention to the fact that Jesus is using this term, the Son of Man, a term which was one of his favorite terms to describe himself, but also that signifies his mission, his purpose in coming to the world. So even the Son of Man, this greatest of all examples, somebody that could have been served, that had all the honor, all the dignity, all the reasons that others might need to serve him, he didn't come to be served, but to serve. He came to give his life. Jesus was not concerned with what he could get out of the world, but what he could give to it. So we have this second example here, and we have to kind of infer that there's a wish being granted. We can think ahead just a couple chapters, again into the Garden of Gethsemane, and Jesus referring to the cup once again, asking that the Father would take the cup from him, and yet not what he, Jesus, wanted, but yes, what the Father wanted. So it's as if the question was being put to Jesus. What is it that you want me to do? And Jesus' response is, not my will, but thine. So we have a stark contrast between the desire of the first two disciples and the desire of Jesus himself. A contrast between wanting to get what they could while they could, and a desire to give what he could. So Jesus and the disciples, the first of these two wishes. Now you might be thinking, there have been two wishes granted, but actually the passage I think correctly would go on just a little bit further, at least to the end of the chapter. And it's the story of a blind man who receives his sight, Bartimaeus. This is an important episode in the Gospel of Mark because it concludes this section, Jesus going into Jerusalem. In chapter 11 and following, we see him arriving in Jerusalem. So there's a bit of a climax to the book. It's the conclusion of these lessons for the disciples as well. We see Mark also introducing one of the minor characters, as he does so often, to transmit important lessons for the reader. And I even see here a little bit of a chiastic structure, an ABA structure, as it were, a contrast with the first disciples, Jesus, and now the concluding episode with blind Bartimaeus. It says that they came to Jericho in verse 46, and as Jesus and his disciples, together with a large crowd, were leaving the city, a blind man, Bartimaeus, that is the son of Timaeus, was sitting by the roadside begging. When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." Many rebuked him and told him to be quiet, but he shouted all the more, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." Now, a blind man seated at the entrance to the city was a common sight. We don't know the history, if he had some previous connection with Jesus or with the disciples. How he received this information, we don't know. But we do see the setting, a blind man without any hope. We spoke of the resume that the two disciples had. The resume of Bartimaeus probably couldn't be any shorter. Blind beggar. And yet he was there asking for mercy as Jesus passed by. And also using this term, this phrase, which is impregnated with significance, Son of David. In the gospel, we see very few people confessing Jesus as the Messiah. We can think back to Peter in Mark chapter 8, at that climactic point, "You are the Messiah, the Christ." And now here, Bartimaeus, not one of the regular disciples, but just every man, a common man, even in his blindness. But using this term, the Son of David, as his confession. And Bartimaeus asking for mercy. It says that many rebuked him. And the idea that we get here is that they continually rebuked him. Not just once or twice, but all those in this multitude were saying the same thing. "Be quiet, shut up. Can't you see that we're in a hurry?" And yet, as they rebuked him, he cried out all the more. He was that much and more so insistent. And Jesus did the surprising thing here. He stopped. He stopped and said, "Call him." So they called to him, to the blind man, and said, "Cheer up, on your feet, he's calling you." Throwing his cloak aside, he jumped to his feet and came to Jesus. There's an economy of words in this little section. The fact that Jesus stopped also is very significant. Everyone else was in a hurry. Everyone else was expectant that they would soon be in Jerusalem and that there would be this climactic event, at least the Passover, but perhaps the sensation that there was more at stake. And yet Jesus said, "Call him." And the words that were used were, in English, we have to add a few words, but actually just 4 words, 3 commands. Cheer up, on your feet, he's calling you. It's as if the disciples didn't want to waste any words on this man. If we could add anything to it, they probably were thinking, well, be quick about it. And Bartimaeus took 2 risky actions here. First of all, throwing his cloak aside, probably his cloak that was spread out before him to receive the offerings that people might throw his way. He cast that aside, and he also jumped to his feet. Now, I can only imagine what's involved, but if you wanted to maybe simulate this, you could go home and try it. Walk around for a few seconds, maybe a few minutes with your eyes closed, and then as you're seated, jump to your feet. And the sensation that you have, the uncertainty, is probably what Bartimaeus sensed at this point. But there was an overwhelming expectancy on his part as well. He jumped to his feet and came to Jesus. Well, this all leads us to verse 51, and it's a very simple verse, easy to overlook. But in actuality, when Jesus asked this question, we see the same question as was given in verse 36. The question is, what is it that you want for me to do for you? So here we have the third wish. We have Jesus asking this blind beggar, what is it that you want? And it's interesting as you trace this through, it's such a common question that you would think, oh, it must be all over the place. But it's actually only 2 times in the Gospels, these 2 episodes. And both times Jesus asking, what is it that you want? Well, Bartimaeus was no mere blind beggar, because Mark places him here at the end of this account. And in God's sovereignty, we see that in Bartimaeus we have an example for all of us. An example of a man of faith, an example of a man with right motives, an example of a man that wanted to honor God. The blind man said, "Rabbi, Lord, I want to see." And in verse 52, "Go," said Jesus, "your faith has healed you," has literally saved you. And immediately he received his sight and followed Jesus along the road. So we have the third wish, like the second being granted here, a resounding yes to this request. And we have to ask ourselves the question, well, why is it that Bartimaeus' wish was granted and the disciples, these 2 close disciples of Jesus, did not receive their request? And you can think of some of the contrast between the 2. The 2 came up to Jesus and were probably thinking, we're fairly self-sufficient, Jesus. All we need here is a little favor. And Bartimaeus looked at his condition. He knew that there was no self-sufficiency. He was a blind beggar. He didn't need a favor. He was pleading for mercy. The 2 probably were thinking, we need to do this quickly. We need to do this secretly. We need to plan a little bit. We need to do this, in effect, as the people in the world are doing this. And Bartimaeus was very much out in the open. He was courageous. He wasn't fearful. He didn't care what people thought. His faith was on display. The 2 were following the pattern that we do see today all over the world. The pattern of the rich and the powerful. And Bartimaeus was acting like a child, insisting. If we didn't know the end of the story, we would almost say whining. Jesus, please help me, please help me, please help me. Insisting. He was single-minded in his request. And of course, the two disciples at this point in this matter were spiritually blind. And Bartimaeus, although physically blind, was spiritually very keen. He knew exactly what was going on. He knew exactly what Jesus could do for him, and that's what he wanted. The two, in effect, were wanting to cultivate sinful attitudes, rise to a position without the sacrifice or without the cost, do so in their own way. And Bartimaeus, if anything, wanted to reverse the effects of sin in his own life. Not his own personal sin necessarily, but the fact that sin has led to blindness, to suffering, and to many things in this world. So Jesus correctly highlights his faith. His faith healed him. And Bartimaeus not only received his sight, but when given this permission to go, literally, you're at ease. You have permission. Do whatever you want now. Bartimaeus took that permission and followed Jesus on the road. This idea of the road also is very important here, but Bartimaeus was doing what Jesus would hope that all disciples would do, that you and I also, given mercy, that we would follow Jesus. Now, I've got to bring this to a conclusion here, and I'd like to just point out some possible applications. And I'd like to start off just by asking, what does your resume look like? I'm not referring to the resume that got you into this school. I understand that everyone has to fill out a resume and submit the applications. But the resume that you're building right now, what is it that you hope to accomplish through this resume? Is it merely to inform other people of your experiences, of your education? Or is there a desire to impress? Through the multiplication of experiences of classes and internships and other things, are you trying to get into a certain level of recognition? When you think about a resume, it's related to a position. We go to the work to fill out a resume, to submit one, because we're expecting to be hired or to be called for a particular position. So you might ask yourself, what sort of position do I deserve? Or maybe turning that question around, is there a type of position which is beneath me? Have I become overqualified for some type of ministry? So you can answer those as you return home, but I think it's a question that needs to be asked periodically, especially now as you're in the midst of so many assignments and tests and things that you have to do. You're probably thinking, why in the world am I here? But try to answer that question. What is it that you hope to gain through your time at the seminary? There may be some times in ministry where the most important thing that you can do is merely to stop and give someone your undivided attention. To merely focus on a person that comes asking for your help. I've noticed here, I don't know if it's a Latin thing, but the clocks in Dallas tend to run a little bit fast, and everyone has a lot on their plate. A lot of things to do. But it could be that that's the thing that you need to do most, is simply to stop. Or it could be that you need to make a decision to minister to a group of quote-unquote nobodies, people that aren't strategically important, people that won't advance your ministry but that need some sort of attention, to give them your time. And as a missionary, I would have to say, too, that I'm troubled by something. This has been for over 20 years now. But as you graduate, I would like to hope that some would be thinking, could God use me best in an overseas setting? Now, I know that there's the feeling, I've got bills to pay, I've attained to this level, I need some sort of a ministry which will provide the means for my family. But if your thought is, maybe I'm overqualified, that if I go overseas, I'm going to bury my gifts. If I go overseas, I'll be speaking like a child for so many years. I would invite you to think about James and John. Perhaps they felt overqualified also. Jesus is not a genie. Jesus doesn't grant merely 2 wishes, but every day he asks us, what is it that you want for me to do for you? That should be a great consolation to all of us. He's asking you right now, what is it that you want for me to do for you. And as we approach Jesus in prayer, we should approach him expectantly, with faith, but overall with a desire to glorify his name, presenting petitions in his name that his kingdom would be advanced, that he would be glorified. And as we ask in this fashion, we can have the assurance that our wishes also will be granted.